Hi, everybody. I am Tracy Butcher, the Director of Outreach. Many of you know me, but for those who don't, I'm based in Cocoa, Florida. And over the last 13 years with Wildlands Network, I've been a lead in the organization's fundraising efforts, outreach, and organizational growth. I'm super excited to see the great turnout of friends and supporters we have tuning in today. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedules as we discuss the unique challenges and opportunities that we face in our conservation efforts in Mexico. We are making great progress in the borderlands region, and Juan Carlos is very excited to have you with us today. I would like to introduce him now. He is our Mexican program director. He was born in Mexico City, and he cultivated an early love of nature by exploring forests and wilds of Mexico. He studied graphic communications at the University of Mexico before he found his calling in conservation. And then he worked for Naturalia, a nonprofit in Mexico, for 15 years, spearheading numerous conservation projects in Northwest Mexico, including helping establish the Northern Jaguar Preserve. He participated in Mexico's first Mexican wolf reintroductions in 2011, and he was involved in the conservation of prairie dogs and beavers in the San Pedro River area. For Wildlands Network, Juan Carlos works to connect the Western Wildway's southern anchor from Sierra de Alamos all the way up through the Cebadillas region of Sonora, Mexico, to the Northern Jaguar Preserve and the Sky Islands on our border. He also is active in raising awareness throughout the United States for the challenges and successes in achieving conservation goals in Mexico. JC, as he's affectionately called by friends and family, lives in Hermosillo, Sonora, with his wife, his newborn daughter, Ursula, who is gorgeous, and his two dogs. Before I hand over to him, I would like to mention that if you have any questions, please type them in the questions box located on your dashboard, and typically that's on the right hand of your screen. After the presentation, if there's time, we will open up the floor for discussion if we have any thoughtful conversations we'd like to have. So without further ado, I will hand over now to Juan Carlos Bravo. And again, thank you very, very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Tracy, for that introduction, and thank you everybody for joining us here for this webinar. I'm going to give a quick introduction to some of the things that are different in terms of implementing wildlife and habitat conservation in Mexico from what those of you who are more familiar with how it works in the United States might find. So basically, Mexico is mostly recognized for its beautiful beaches, its very diverse culture, and its world-class cuisine. And what people seldom realize is that this cultural and culinary diversity has its roots in a very diverse landscape. It's not just about beautiful beaches. There are all these different ecosystems in Mexico: thorn scrub, temperate forest, tropical deciduous forest, tropical rainforest, grasslands, all kinds of things that we find, and some of them are probably too small, montane, high elevation ecosystems that are not showing in this map. But it gives you a sense of where our culture and our food gets its diversity from. And with Mexico being one of the hotspots for biodiversity, one of the countries of most biodiversity in the world, we have a huge responsibility to protect what's in it. It is also the country of iconic species such as jaguars, Mexican wolves, and black bears. All of these, some of the species that we share with the United States. As Tracy was mentioning, what we used to call the spine of the continent, we now call the Western Wildway, has its southernmost tip in the Sonora Chihuahua region of the northern Sierra Madre Occidental and the Sky Islands, a binational area called after the numerous isolated mountain ranges that are surrounded by a sea of grasslands and desert. And we have here in this region many partners and collaborators that make it possible to create this continent-wide corridor, such as the Northern Jaguar Project, Nature and Culture International, Pro Natura Noroeste. We rely on collaborations with all of these partners to make our landscape conservation work effective. And among the many different things that are different in Mexico, the most striking one perhaps is just the culture and how people relate to the landscape and the wildlife in a very different manner than what they do in the United States. For Native peoples, wild animals still hold special powers, reinterpreted through a Catholic lens in many of the festivities and the rituals that take place in Mexico. And now these native cultures are finding their territories threatened by major development projects and so they've become defendants of much of what's left of the natural landscape in Mexico. Think Little Rock happening all over the country, in a country where there's also several environmental defendants killed each year. So that is a big issue that we face here in Mexico. And we're going to struggle for many years to find a way in which we can manage the vast landscapes that that make up the ecosystems that I was showing you in this map at first. Strict wilderness conservation is another concept that culturally is very different in Mexico. There is no concept of, there's no word for wilderness in Spanish. And so everybody is hoping that some form of sustainable development will achieve the conservation goals that we have, and that we will find this idyllic balance between rural communities and nature. I do, however, think that there is a need for wilderness preservation and for spaces that are not managed by rural communities, but rather left alone to find their own paths in evolution. And that is still a very fringe idea here in Mexico. So culturally, we have to break down some of these barriers in the future if we hope to create large landscape conservation that's effective. Another significant difference is just the legality of things. There is certainly a legal framework that provides equivalence to the Endangered Species Act, the Environmental Protection Agency, and some of the instruments that you guys might be more familiar with. We have those things in Mexico. Mexico is also a signatory of every major international environmental treaty, even more so, I would think, than the United States. And there's certainly room for improvement in terms of regulation, but where the big problem lies in terms of legality in Mexico is law enforcement. Law enforcement in Mexico is appallingly bad, and this reality has impacted every aspect of life in Mexico, and conservation is certainly no exception to this. Every administration has had its own way of at least pretending to deal with the problem, and the outgoing president, Peña Nieto, created a new police force, a federal police force called the Gendarmería, with the intent of having a corps that was somewhat isolated from the corruption that plagues other law enforcement bodies. And the Gendarmería actually has what they call an environmental mission, which then becomes the first environmental law enforcement agency of the country. Its first results seem to be promising, but there have been warnings from human rights activists that because of how it was set up to protect the environment and strategic water infrastructure such as dams and pipelines, it could be used against communities defending their land from these massive projects to build dams and aqueducts. So there's I would say the jury's still out on if this new environmental police will be a good thing or a bad thing. Another significant difference in how things are in Mexico is land tenure. People in the United States are used to vast federal lands or public lands, whether federal or state, that in a sense belong to everybody and are there for the enjoyment of everybody. And we have no such concept in Mexico. Everything is divided up. Either individuals own parcels, as you can see in this map, of the corner of Sonora and Chihuahua, just south of Arizona and New Mexico. All those little parcels are private properties, except for the large orange hashed ones, which are communal properties called ejidos. Ejidos are a way of managing land by a set number of people and through a governing body, and they have their own challenges and are in many occasions some of the poorest land managers in the country, which internally suffer a lot from the tragedy of the commons. So when you see the protected areas in Mexico, as I'm showing here, Bavispe, Janos, and Campo Verde, these protected areas are not in the same sense as in the United States, where they're federal lands where everybody can go and enjoy, and they're set apart for wildlife management or ecosystem management. They are a layer of regulation over this mosaic of private and communal lands. That's all they are. People live within there and farm within those areas and ranch within those areas, and even mining and other very impactful activities happen within those areas, only within a different regulatory framework, which can be, but is not always adequately enforced. So how do you make a landscape whole when it's so fragmented, when you have so many challenges with law enforcement, when there's a culture that does not inherently embrace wilderness and accept the value of wildlife for its own sake? Well, what we do is we follow as best we can the model of a conservation network put forward by our founders, Michael Soule and John Terborg, who I believe John has joined us in this call. He'll be. It's an honor to have you here, and you'll be happy to see how this framework has been implemented here in Mexico. It starts with protecting core areas that are as large and as wild as we can find them, and we put on them as many layers of protection as we can, so that they can be the nucleus from which species can find refuge and thrive. Species such as large carnivores and there are other keystone species need to be protected also within these areas and in the surrounding regions. The communities need to be engaged to create buffers of compatible use land around these areas, and corridors need to be established between these areas. And so you establish a network on the landscape. This network on the landscape will depend a lot on a network of people that can support it through donations, volunteer work, adding their voices to campaigns, sharing their knowledge, and certainly, and most recently, through citizen science efforts. How does this model actually look like after 3 years of Wildlands Network in Mexico? Well, I'm going to show you some of the core areas that we're trying to protect, starting out with Bavispe, which is in the heart of the Sky Islands region, which is marked here in red. Bavispe is a very important natural protected area, which was which had to be had its decree updated, and this updating was neglected by the federal agencies for many years, which threatened to erase it from the conservation map. And so we started a campaign in 2016, which put pressure on the Minister of the Environment through several different fronts, through a lawsuit, through campaigning from Congress, and a letter of more than 40 experts and organizations that was sent directly to the Minister of the Environment, and which culminated in the updating of the decree of Bavispe and providing it with legal certainty in 2017, and allowing for much of the conservation work in the Sky Islands of Mexico to continue to move forward. Bavispe is, well, as you can see, it gets its fair share of snow in the winter. It is important to note that it is also one of the northernmost places where jaguars can be found in Mexico. So a very contrasting thing where you can imagine a jaguar walking on snow. And this is the kind of landscape that that makes up Bavispe, where there's also very progressive fire management going on that's comparable in some ways to what's going on in the United States, but with a history of less over management, I would say. And it's home to black bears, which interestingly enough in this region of Mexico are not black, but they're actually this cinnamon color. Another area that we work to protect is the Cebadillas parcel in the Ejido Tutuaca, in the Tutuaca protected area. This is the largest nesting ground for thick-billed parrots. Thick-billed parrots are a species that prefers these kinds of old growth forests. The area has some of the oldest trees still remaining in Mexico. It's one of the few places where you can still find trees 500 to 1,000 years old in Mexico. And of course, they're preferred by thick-billed parrots to build their nests. And so we've been working for almost 20 years in collaboration with ProNatura Noroeste to make sure that that these forests are spared from logging through an easement. And we're hoping to get the agreement with the landowners and Ejido updated this year, and at some point establish a remote monitoring system that would allow us to check the condition of the forest regularly from anywhere in the world. These are not the only species that we work to protect. We have an interest in jaguars and Mexican wolves as well. And so one of the major threats we found that that we are addressing is the border wall. And we are specially positioned by having staff in both Mexico and the United States to provide solid information for decision makers, which is what we did with this report that we shared with members of Congress. Our staff member Miles was in Congress sharing it with congressional staff and some members of Congress, and putting in perspective how the importance of these species was being neglected in a moment when actually border crossing apprehensions were going down from historical high levels. So we bring the science to the people that make these decisions on behalf of the species that we care for. And we also do outreach work for these species. A lot of people do not realize how much habitat some of these species share between both countries. And so we've got social media pieces that come out with very illustrative maps. These are interpretations of maps that come out in scientific journals, and that would probably remain there if it weren't for efforts like ours to bring them to a broader audience. And some of them are static maps, such as the ones above, but we also make animated maps to tell people the story of, for example, this individual wolf that was released in Mexico and made all the way to Las Cruces, across the border, and then crossed back into Mexico. And so we tell these stories to generate awareness of the plight of these animals, especially in the context of the border wall. I'm also a member of the jaguar expert group, an advisory body that that provides information for policy and strategy for the federal government. And one of the interesting things we've been able to do is advise on a specific case where we requested wildlife crossings for jaguar in the western state of Nayarit after an incident where a jaguar was killed in a new highway. And so we assisted the local groups in crafting the right kind of request and sending it to the right people and getting signatures from experts from all over the country. That kind of advocacy is what we're helping our partners in Mexico achieve. Apart from working with cores and carnivores, we also try to work with communities, and we certainly think they are the ranchers of Sonora are an important community for the borderlands region, and more so when you start talking about large carnivores. And while we recognize that local groups are going to be more effective in broad outreach and education, we have found a niche in supporting individual ranchers that already embrace conservation but need some support in addressing numerous planning and management issues they face. And so we're focusing particularly in Rancho El Aribabi, which, as you can see in this map, sits in a bottleneck for what is the jaguar corridor that has allowed some very famous jaguars to reach Arizona. Yoko, El Jefe, Macho B, all presumably walked through this corridor and through this bottleneck. And the owners of Aribabi are trying to protect this. We started our collaboration with them by protecting the Cocospera River and the riparian forest that surrounds it from development plans by transportation authorities that you're seeing in this picture, who we took to the place and explained to them why they should not build a new road right along the river. And we got them to change the route of the road with the owner's input. You're seeing the owner there, Carlos Robles, here. He was able to provide his input on the road, and so now the road steers away from the river thanks to our intervention, and with also some potential to restore an old cienega here as part of the compensation work. And to make sure that Aribabi remains protected for many years, we're helping foster the creation of a new group, Friends of Rancho El Aribabi, as a nonprofit in Arizona that can advise the owners in sustainable ranching and drafting and implementing a conservation plan. Another big project we have in the borderlands is the one that we do for Highway 2 with support from the Fish and Wildlife Service that has the Wildlife Without Borders program, of which we have a grant that has allowed us to look into how this highway, highlighted in yellow in the map, is an obstacle to species moving between our countries. Jaguars especially, but also we are concerned with black bears, the population in Mexico being less abundant and in need of continual gene flow from the United States, and ocelots, which move a lot through this landscape. And I'll ask you to remember this private protected area, Los Ojos, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. When I explain our work there, we started work in Highway 2, identifying every bridge and drainage along the highway that could serve a double purpose as a wildlife crossing, whether for large species or small species, such as amphibians that can use these kinds of crossings. And also figuring out which ones needed to be cleaned up to better serve that purpose. And with support from Skyland Alliance and through the Fish and Wildlife Service grant, we're also monitoring roadkill along the area. So we end up with maps like this that give us a sense of where more animals are killed along the road in stretches of 500 meters, and as they cross the private protected area of Cuenca Los Ojos. And we also know where major drainages are, which are displayed in the map below as dark spots. And so we're requesting transportation authorities to create a little corridor here, fenced, 20 kilometers fenced here, so that the existing drainages can serve as wildlife corridors. And we've actually just obtained records of cougars using this drainage and this drainage right here to cross the highway. Now we're in this new stage of setting up cameras in some of these drainages to figure out who else is using the drainages. And ultimately, our goal is to have some wildlife crossings established in these places, including overpasses, such as the one in this 3D model that an expert did for us. And we also advocate for these structures throughout the country. What you're seeing is the Congressman Germán Ralís, who presented an initiative to make wildlife crossings mandatory throughout the country, and organized a forum in the lower chamber of Congress in Mexico City, which myself and other experts attended to advocate for wildlife crossings. And finally, apart from our corridor work in these wildlife crossings, we are now gradually getting engaged in the field of citizen scientists, allowing us to foster the networks of people that we need to support the networks of wildlands. What we're doing is, what you see in the picture is one of our volunteers helping burrowing owl in Hermosillo. We started mapping the location of burrowing owl sites in Hermosillo, my home city, after an incident where a child killed one, and it made the news, and people were very upset about this and trying to figure out what to do. So we were contacted as wildlife experts, and we started this monitoring project to figure out what the condition of the population of burrowing owls is in Hermosillo. And we are supporting a lot of our work through the iNaturalist app, which in Mexico is known as Naturalista, and it allows us to have people take pictures of burrowing owls wherever they see them in town and upload them to a project where we can get the coordinates and start making an assessment of what's the condition of the population of these burrowing owls. And though this project probably won't have a conservation goal that I don't know, creates a vast landscape of conservation or a critical corridor for wildlife, what it does is it creates awareness in a culture that, like I mentioned before, has very little awareness of the needs of wildlife and wild places, by using a charismatic species that people can see all over a town that has a lot of influence on the Sky Islands region and northern Sierra Madre Occidental. And this is what the kind of map that we're doing, where specific locations of the burrowing owls are blurred to prevent vandalism and just people messing with them. But we also get a sense of where these animals are located, and we're finding a very healthy colony of them in the University of Sonora. This is how all these pieces sort of fit together to make the networks of conservation in the landscape and in people's minds and hearts. A lot of this work has been supported by the Wilberforce Foundation, which we are very grateful for, and we are hoping to expand our Mexican program next year by hiring new staff and hopefully bringing on a policy person that can work from Mexico City. So I think that we're off to a great start in these first few years. They have given us a chance to plan ahead, and now we're ready to move forward to a stage of growth and more ambitious goals in the future. I hope you will all join us and help us with that. So I'm gonna leave this here with my contact information, and for those of you who want to get engaged in some way, I would ask you to go ahead and sign our No Well petition. And I'm going to leave the web address right there. So, questions? Let me see. Has anybody got any question? No questions? Everything was incredibly clear. And Santiago here is asking, are there plans for similar corridors elsewhere in Mexico? Wildlands Network right now is focusing on this area. I know for sure there is an intent of establishing a Sierra Madre Oriental corridor, which is probably just as ambitious. Conavio has also the Corredor Mesoamericano. And many of these initiatives have the big challenge of recognizing that the landscape has been used by people for many millennia. And so you can't really create corridors for just wildlife. You have to figure out how these corridors can accommodate for both. And also there's Nature and Culture International is expanding the Sierra Madre Occidental corridor south of Alamos. So our efforts reach as far south as Alamos, and it's Nature and Culture International who takes it from there south into Sinaloa. John Makowski is wondering where our funding comes from. Primarily the Wilberforce Foundation, like I mentioned. The Fish and Wildlife Service has been a good supporter of the Highway 2 project. All of our Highway 2 and Wildlife Crossings project has been funded by them. We have received also some funding, by the way, from the transportation authorities in support of that project. And there's individuals, the Wellborn family, the Schaffner families, and have supported our work for many years in this region of Mexico. We have another question. How do you develop good working relations with the transportation divisions to get actual implementation with the engagement of the private landowner key? Yes, I mean, the Transportation Authority right now, the Federal Transportation Authority, has a policy now of working with landowners rather than against them. They realized at some point that they were losing a lot of the lawsuits and losing a lot of time and money in lawsuits going against landowners. So they try to work with landowners. And so when Aribabi was concerned about the route, I called the right agency, the Environmental Impact Office in the agency, and explained to them that we would really want them to see the place for themselves to understand the landowner. And so they came to Sonora, and with the intent of convincing us that this route was the best because it was the closest and cheapest. And it worked the other way around. The forest convinced them that that they were wrong, and they saw it with their own eyes, and that started a good relationship in that we were both willing to sit down and discuss our issues, and we've been working with them quite well since then, I have to admit. What else? Do you get good cooperation from the landowners? Gradually so. Right now, a lot of the work here that we do in Wildlands is mostly me subcontracting field staff. So I don't get to contact that many landowners, but those I do, I certainly have a good relationship. Like I said, we're focusing on people who are already interested in conservation, and we're letting the local groups be more in the forefront of making that transition. So right now we do have a good relationship with the few landowners that we work with. How about Imperial Woodpeckers? Any chance they're still alive in some remote mountain forest? I don't think so, honestly. I don't think there's a tree large enough to accommodate Imperial Woodpeckers left in Mexico, regretfully. And for the thick-billed parrots, any ideas about how population is trending in recent years? What could be done to create more parrot colonies? Has anyone tried artificial nest cavities? The people working most closely with the parrots are Pronatura Noroeste. And one of the things that we want to explore doing with them as an expansion of the program is figuring out where they go when they're not nesting. And it's been incredibly challenging for them to put radio tracking devices on on these parrots because they will destroy absolutely everything that you put on them. But I think they're finding the right model, and they're figuring out where they nest, where they go farther south when they're not nesting. So that would be the expansion that conservation, habitat conservation needs for them. The population trends vary, and they did have a dip a few years ago. They seem to be rebounding, but it's a cautious optimism, I think, at this point. Not sure if Natura has tried artificial nest cavities. There's another question here by James. Do you think the Mexican wolf recovery plan aiming for 200 wolves in Mexico is plausible with all the issues you've presented? I think it is certainly possible to have 200 wolves in Mexico, maybe even more, but not with the kind of funding that the Mexico government is putting into this program, not with the kind of funding that we're getting from the U.S. partners in this initiative. There are many issues that need to be resolved, but the goal, I think, is certainly achievable. There's interest also in creating sanctuaries for these animals where they find good places to den. I also think that regardless of what the goal is in Mexico, the United States is not at this point doing enough to protect wolves in the United States, and there's been a sentiment that they're trying to overburden Mexico with the responsibility of protecting the species. Is Trump's wall going to present serious obstacles for wildlife? Yes, certainly. The wall is already there in some places, and it's already presenting an obstacle to many species of wildlife. We have in our website a link to our report on some of the species that will be affected, but certainly many species that migrate or disperse or just move around the landscape in that area are going to be impacted by the border wall. It should not be allowed to go up, both for humanitarian reasons and for environmental reasons. A question here by John: are you working with the Desert Landscape Conservation Cooperative? Yes, we are. I was involved in that initiative at first, and now it's been taken over by our Tucson office. We've assisted in planning, and they asked us to nominate pilot areas to protect, and Wildlands Network designed with partners an area called the Transboundary Madrean Watersheds, and our design was submitted. We submitted our design and was accepted as one of the pilot areas where the Desert LCC is going to be focusing a lot of its planning efforts. Are there incentives for landowners to enter into conservation easement agreements? Can easements be perpetual, or are they limited to 99 years? Incentives, well, yes, and not incentives in the sense that you get a big tax break. Land tax in Mexico is not a big issue. It's not incredibly expensive, so there's not that much of an incentive. Some states do contemplate the possibility of waiving even that fee, but it has not been implemented to my knowledge anywhere, even though the law kind of accepts that it can be done. So it's mostly private incentives, and the incentive, for example, in the case of Aribabi, by being designated as a private conservation area by CONAMP, the parks agency, it's in the map so that when the road agency wants to put a road through them, they have to look at it differently. It's a protected area, and the same case will go for any development that goes through protected lands. So there's an incentive there. Can easements be perpetual, or are they limited to 99 years? That's a good question for lawyers, really. What I do know is that the ProNatura, who has been working more with easements than anyone else in Mexico, is shying away from long-term easements, and long-term meaning anything more than 30 years, because there's really no certainty to what might happen to the land after there's a generational change in land ownership and many of these things. So even if the law might allow for it, as a conservation strategy, it seems like keeping an eye on it every 30 years is the best you can hope for. A question from Mariana Leal. I'm gonna try and translate in Ejido Chihuahua, Tutuaca. How have we noticed the impact of forestry in the populations of species that are endemic to this area? Well, the impact has been recorded for many, many years. The extinction of the Imperial woodpecker is certainly associated to that. So it's been happening for many years. It's hard for me to tell from any particular study or something if other species have been impacted, but my immediate assumption would be that they have constantly. And so creating these pockets where the landowners agree not to bring down any of these trees, especially the large trees that are needed for the thick-billed parrots nests. Those things are definitely very, very necessary. And in a scenario of climate change where forest fires are more intense and more frequent, we can only expect even more impacts to biodiversity in here. There's a follow-up question from Santiago, and I'm going to try and open this window a little bit more, see if I can. Can you tell us more about what? Sorry, I'm trying to open this window as much as I can, but I can't see the, oh, more about the parrots, saving them from extinction. I think, yeah, I've mentioned we're trying to protect, we're trying to figure out where they spend the summers, sorry, their winters when they're not nesting. And once we figure that out, we will have to come up with some kind of strategy with partners in the region. How confident are you that wildlife diversity can be maintained indefinitely in portions and in all of Mexico? Well, life finds a way. And more people are interested in protecting the landscape. There are some positive changes that I see in how we go about protecting things, not just the environment and species, but also rural communities and the rule of law and several other things in Mexico. Many human rights defendants groups have become more proficient, more well-funded in the last few years, and that has been a priority in Mexico. But it might seem unrelated, but it has set the stage for better transparency laws, better government accountability. And once you have those things, then environmental groups have a chance to become again more proficient and better well-funded, and then use these tools to provide better protection for wildlife. So there are some encouraging developments. They're still, I think, somewhat isolated, and it's our work to connect them and make the people that are doing great local progress feel more connected to a network of conservation throughout the region and eventually throughout the country. Do I believe that the President-elect López Obrador will support the work that the eco sector of the Gendarmería has done thus far and looking towards the future? It's hard to tell. The Gendarmería, I think, has a big stigma of being just another police force, which a strategy that hasn't worked in the past. That we don't need necessarily more police forces, we need better police forces. So it's hard to tell if they'll just erase the whole Gendarmería and leave a gap there, or if they'll figure out, you know what, there's something positive about this, and we just have to make sure that that it's used in the right way. Really hard to tell at this point many of the things that might happen with the new president-elect. But you know, if he does, as he said, tackling issues of corruption, and he has spoken against the big, massive projects that are impacting rural communities, and the person that's most likely to take the environmental ministry has spoken against things such as fracking. I think there are some positive things in the future. It's too early to tell, honestly. Did I miss any of these questions? Oh, somebody appreciated all my maps. Thank you, Denise. I love maps, and though I'm no GIS expert, I think they're a great way to communicate stuff. I think those are all the questions that we have, and thank you all for being here and your kind words of encouragement. I hope you can continue to be interested in our work in Mexico and supporting Wildlands Network in some way. Tracy?
Thanks, JC. Yes, thanks, JC. This is a great presentation, really informative, and you can tell you were a graphic designer. It's very beautiful. You're doing amazing work, and well, very well done.
Thank you.
Quickly or add to what you said about the thick-billed parrot work. You're being very modest, and our work down there has been very significant on two levels. The acreage that's been protected for thick-billed parrots has been leveraged with adjacent ejidos because of our work, and the local people are very on sides with this project. They love it. They embrace it. They want more land protected. For an outreach and PR tool for thick-billed parrots, it's been a fantastic program that's arguably saved these birds from extinction. So you're being very modest about that, and we do have great support for that program from donors who are on this call and from close friends. So I did want to just elaborate on that a little bit, because
Sure.
That's a really important program, and we're very, very excited about it. And I wanted to just add on to that.
I'll add to that it's because it's a long-term program. It's been one where we've actually achieved one of the major goals of conservation, which is to change people's minds to a point where our intervention gradually becomes less and less necessary. At this point, it started out with a bunch of crazy people from Monterrey and Mexico City and the United States trying to protect this for parrots, and now the communities are all about the parrots, and they've got their mascot and they've got their festivals going on, and that was all possible because we invested in that project initially. We kept at it. ProNatura leveraged our investment with their work in the community. And it's certainly been a success story because of all the many years that we've put into it. I hope to see that kind of turnaround from the communities in the other places where we work in the future. That's for sure. And sorry I didn't delve that much into it, but I was trying to cover a lot of landscape and many species.
Great. I just that is one of, for me, that's a huge project that's done really well with over a lot of time. And as you say, it's changing culture, which is not easy. And during these times, it's really appreciated. So I did want to add on
to have a logging community appreciate the inherent value of a parrot. Yeah, it's like how can it be any better than that?
Right. Well, anyway, moving on, I would like to thank everybody one more time for coming and joining us today and giving us your time. It's precious, and I know you're very, very busy. I'd love to thank all of our donors who bring their passion and their resources and their talent to Wildlands Network, and to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NCI, Northern Jaguar Project, ProNatura, and all of our friends, partners, and collaborators that are reconnecting nature in Mexico. This is great work, and it wouldn't happen without each one of you and all of these collaborative efforts. You will soon receive a follow-up email with a link to this webinar. You are invited to share it far and wide, and please feel free to give us any feedback you would like to do on these presentations. And then for those of you who would like more detailed information on our work, you can contact Juan Carlos at wildlandsnetwork.org for more information, or me if you know me. You can please do fill out the petition that he showed, the link that is still up, I believe, that is urging the United States Congress to not build more of the border wall and to stop any further appropriations of funds. And if you'd like to make a donation to our Mexican program, or if you'd like to discuss your giving plans for the year, please feel free to contact me. Juan Carlos is shy $15,000 this year of reaching a goal that would secure stable expansion of the Mexico program throughout 2019. So we are looking for funds to support that. That's about all I have to say today. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. Thanks one more time for joining us, and have a great weekend, everybody. And
thank you all for joining us. No, I just want to thank everybody that was here and have a great weekend.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Bye, everybody.
Gracias.